August 25, 1942, 23:30 hours, the black beaches of Milne Bay, Papua. The air inside the landing craft was heavy, humid, and thick with the smell of salt and rotting vegetation. Rain had just fallen, turning the sandy beaches into a sticky mire. Lieutenant Commander Masajiro Hayashi of the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces (SNLF), the feared Imperial Marines, stepped silently onto the shore. His mission: seize the Allied airfields at Milne Bay. Hayashi was a veteran commander, filled with the unshakable belief in Japanese superiority that permeated the Imperial Army. For months, the Japanese forces had been invincible, sweeping across the Pacific, conquering territories with ease. They had faced armies, British, Dutch, American, and crushed them, often achieving victory against overwhelming odds through sheer fanaticism and ruthlessness. Now, in the dark, humid jungle of Papua, he expected the same easy victory. The intelligence reports confirmed his expectations. Milne Bay was defended by only a small garrison of Australians, mostly ill-trained militia. The defenders were, in his mind, soft, weak, and unprepared for the fighting spirit of the SNLF. Hayashi expected a swift, decisive night attack, a complete rout, and the capture of the airfields by dawn. This was merely a logistical cleanup operation, a minor stepping stone on the path to ultimate victory in Australia itself. The reality on the ground was immediately and jarringly different. Milne Bay was not a simple coastal target. It was a hellish labyrinth of dense jungle, malaria-infested swamps, and torrential rain. The constant downpours turned every road and track into a knee-deep bog of clinging mud, often paralyzing their vital supply movements. Movement was agonizingly slow, and the tropical diseases were already beginning to take their toll on his men before a single shot was fired. The jungle, which the Japanese considered their ally, was proving to be a neutral, unforgiving enemy, complicating every tactical plan. Hayashi's immediate objective was to utilize the darkness and the jungle cover to execute a silent, terrifying infiltration. The SNLF were masters of this approach, trained to rely on speed, stealth, and bayonet charges to instill panic. They believed the enemy would break at the first determined assault, a psychological tactic that had worked flawlessly in Malaya and Singapore. They relied heavily on the enemy's expected fear. However, the Australian defenders were far from the soft militia Hayashi expected. Unknown to the Japanese, the Allied command had secretly reinforced Milne Bay with elements of the seasoned Australian Imperial Force, ADF. Battle-hardened veterans recently returned from the desert fighting against Rommel's Afrika Korps in the Middle East. Furthermore, the defence was centrally organised by an astute British general, Clowes, who had meticulously prepared the forward positions, creating deep, interlocking fields of fire that exploited the narrow tracks of the jungle. The Australians had learned a crucial lesson from the earlier defeats in Malaya and Singapore. The jungle is an ally if you respect it. They did not wait passively for the Japanese to attack. Instead, they cut interlocking fields of fire, booby-trapped the most likely avenues of approach, and used the dense jungle as a cover for deadly, prepared ambushes. Their strategy was simple: draw the Japanese onto the narrow paths and then destroy them with concentrated machine gun fire and pre-registered artillery. The first clash came shortly after midnight. Hayashi's lead patrol, moving with the assumed silence of superiority, stumbled directly into a pre-sighted Australian machine gun position manned by the veteran AIF troops. The night exploded with fire. But it wasn't just the sheer volume of the return fire that shocked the Japanese. It was the discipline and tenacity of the Australian defence. They held their ground, maintained their fire lanes, and inflicted devastating losses on the forward Japanese units, who expected the enemy to panic and scatter after the initial volley. The Japanese SNLF troops were forced to fight in small, isolated pockets, unable to utilise their famous speed and infiltration tactics effectively in the prepared Australian killing zones. Hayashi quickly discovered that the Australians were not merely defending, they were fighting with a ferocity and cunning that matched his own elite troops. This was not the easy victory promised by intelligence. This was the start of a grinding, brutal battle that would challenge the very foundation of the Japanese military's belief in its own invincibility in jungle warfare, threatening to turn the tide of the entire Pacific campaign. The psychological component of this early resistance was paramount. The SNLF forces had been trained to view any non-Japanese combatant as fundamentally inferior. The sustained, accurate fire and the refusal of the Australian lines to yield under the pressure of the bayonet charge delivered a devastating blow to this core belief. Each dead or wounded Japanese soldier represented a tiny crack in the carefully constructed facade of imperial power. As the morning light began to filter through the dense canopy, Hayashi, after reviewing the staggering casualties from the initial hours, realized the gravity of his miscalculation. The defenders were well armed, well trained, and prepared to fight to the last man. The Allied airfields, far from being a soft target, were protected by a core of fierce resistance that showed no sign of faltering. The Battle of Milne Bay was quickly transitioning from a swift invasion to a desperate, costly siege. The sun would rise on a scene of carnage that would, in time, become the beginning of the end for the myth of the unstoppable Imperial Japanese soldier. August 26-28, 1942, the airfields and forward tracks of Milne Bay. The morning after Lieutenant Commander Hayashi's shocking initial setback, the battle shifted from a purely ground engagement to a terrifying, three-dimensional contest. The Japanese forces, reeling from the ferocious Australian defence, sought to exploit the hours of daylight to regroup and launch a coordinated offensive. They did so with a crucial assumption, rooted in their successful history in the Pacific. Allied air support would be negligible or non-existent. The Japanese command had planned this assault meticulously, relying on the fact that the jungle airfields at Milne Bay were considered isolated, poorly maintained, and protected only by inadequate fighter cover. The SNLF were conditioned to believe that any early Allied aircraft would be quickly overwhelmed by Japanese fighters flying out of nearby Rabaul. This assumption proved to be the second and arguably fatal miscalculation of the Milne Bay campaign. Unbeknownst to the invaders, the Royal Australian Air Force RAAF had managed to secretly base 3 squadrons of P-40 Kittyhawks at the very airfields the Japanese were attempting to seize. These aircraft were robust, heavily armed, and their pilots were desperate to engage the enemy. The air war began just as the Japanese were consolidating their positions on the jungle tracks. The P-40 Kittyhawks, flying low over the dense canopy, suddenly roared down onto the exposed Japanese columns. For the Japanese troops, the attack was a massive, unexpected psychological and physical shock. They were fighting through a jungle hellscape, struggling with mud and machine gun fire, when the entire sky seemed to open up with fire and steel. The impact of the low-level strafing runs was immediate and devastating. The P-40s, armed with 650 caliber machine guns and capable of carrying bombs, focused their attacks on the narrow coastal tracks, the only reliable avenues of Japanese advance. The Japanese supply lines, already fragile due to the mud, were shattered. Ammunition, medical supplies, and food were destroyed. The tightly packed columns of SNLF troops became easy targets for the relentless bombing and strafing. Lieutenant Commander Hayashi watched in horror as his columns, moving with practiced discipline, were torn apart by the unseen attackers. His men, trained for bayonet charges and close-quarters jungle combat, had no effective defense against the concentrated fire from the air. Their own anti-aircraft capabilities were minimal, and their attempts to return fire with the rifles were futile. The psychological effect of being stalked by a relentless, fast-moving airborne enemy that could deliver death seemingly at will was immense. The presence of the Kittyhawks immediately tipped the tactical balance in favour of the Australians. The Australian ground forces, now emboldened and protected, used the airstrikes to their full advantage. Whenever the Japanese columns were pinned down by air attack, the Australian militia and AIF units would launch fierce, localised counterattacks, maximising the confusion. The air and ground forces were working in perfect coordination, a seamless, integrated defence that the Japanese intelligence had failed to predict. The Kittyhawks did more than just strafe. They acted as reconnaissance eyes for the Australian command, constantly reporting on Japanese troop movements and concentrations. This air superiority meant that the Japanese could not launch a surprise attack, nor could they consolidate their troops without risking total annihilation from above. The jungle, which had initially shielded the SNLF, now trapped them. The most humiliating aspect for the Japanese was the timing. The Japanese High Command had assumed their own aircraft from Rabaul would quickly establish air supremacy. However, the RAAF pilots proved ferociously effective, and the Australian airfields, far from being neutralised, were fully operational, fuelled, and protected. The sheer speed and ferocity of the Kittyhawks shattered the myth of Japanese air invincibility over the region. The Japanese began referring to the Kittyhawks with fear, recognizing that their logistical and tactical plans were now dependent on weather and chance, hoping for cloud cover to shield them from the merciless Australian air attacks. The Battle of Milne Bay was quickly becoming a desperate retreat for the Japanese forces, dictated by the relentless appearance of the P-40 Kittyhawks. August 28-30, 1942, the perimeter of Airfield No. 3, Milne Bay, Papua. The battle for Milne Bay reached its bloody climax as Lieutenant Commander Hayashi and the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces realized the full extent of their predicament. They were bogged down, suffering massive losses from the air, and facing an enemy whose defiance was utterly unexpected. Recognizing that time was now the enemy, Hayashi ordered a desperate, maximal effort: take the airfields immediately, regardless of cost. The ensuing days saw the clash between two fundamentally different military philosophies: the Japanese reliance on the human spirit and the psychological terror of the bayonet charge, versus the Australian reliance on systematic defense and overwhelming firepower supported by air superiority. The Japanese launched wave after wave of banzai charges. These were terrifying assaults, men screaming, driven by a code that forbade surrender, charging directly into the pre-sighted Australian defences. In earlier battles across the Pacific, this psychological tactic had often worked, breaking the enemy's will to fight. But at Milne Bay, the Australian defence held firm. The Australians did not break. They were veterans who understood the discipline of fire. They let the Japanese troops close the range, allowing the jungle to channel the attackers into the narrow killing zones, and then unleashed devastating, sustained bursts of machine gun fire, mortars, and rifle fire. The effect was carnage. The charging Japanese troops were simply mowed down by the sheer volume of metal projected at them. The Australian defence was genius in its simplicity. They built robust, interlocking pillboxes and slit trenches, small, fortified positions that supported each other with covering fire. When one position was threatened, the other two would focus their fire on the attacking Japanese. This systematic approach rendered the Japanese tactic of bypassing and isolating enemy strongpoints, a method that had worked in Malaya, completely ineffective. Furthermore, the ground troops were now receiving unprecedented levels of close air support from the RAAF Kittyhawks. The Australian pilots, operating from the airfield just a few hundred yards behind the front line, were able to fly sorties that were so close and so low that their strafing runs essentially acted as mobile artillery. A Japanese charge would begin, and within minutes, the roar of the Kittyhawk engines would fill the air. The pilots, flying so close to the tree line that the Japanese could see the faces of the Australian airmen, would unleash a torrent of fire, often strafing positions just feet in front of the Australian trenches. This coordinated response was a massive psychological blow to the Japanese, who had no way to counter the combined assault of ground fire and air power. They were being attacked from every dimension. The Japanese SNLF began to suffer from a catastrophic lack of supplies. The Kittyhawks had successfully neutralized the logistical chain, bombing the landing beaches and destroying supply dumps. Without food, without medical aid, and without reinforcements, the SNLF troops were reduced to a desperate, starving force, still fighting with fanatical courage, but fundamentally crippled by logistics. The final, desperate assault came against Airfield No. 3. In a last, furious effort, the Japanese managed to penetrate the outer perimeter, pushing the Australian militia to their breaking point. It was a chaotic, hand-to-hand affair, fought in the darkness and the mud, but the Australian reserves, including the seasoned AIF veterans, counterattacked with brutal efficiency. The jungle ambush, which the Japanese had intended to execute, had been turned back upon them. The Australians, fighting on their own prepared ground, demonstrated a mastery of jungle combat that matched, and then exceeded, the SNLF. They fought with a calm, disciplined fury, driving the Japanese back from the airstrips and securing the final, decisive moments of the battle. The fierce resistance shattered the Japanese command's core belief. They were no longer facing a weak militia. They were facing a professional, well-supported, and utterly determined army. Milne Bay was not just a defeat. It was a revelation that the myth of Japanese invincibility was, in fact, an illusion shattered by Australian discipline ingenuity, and the devastating speed of the Kittyhawks. September 1942 and beyond, the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Navy, RAAF, the Battle of Milne Bay concluded not with a formal surrender, but with a desperate, chaotic retreat. The Japanese command, stunned and humiliated, recognized the impossibility of the situation. Under heavy fire and constant aerial bombardment, the surviving Special Naval Landing Forces were evacuated, abandoning their objective, their heavy equipment, and a significant number of their dead. The official casualty count was damning for the Imperial forces, over 600 elite SNLF troops killed or missing, compared to 167 Allied casualties. But the true loss was immeasurable, the loss of the myth of invincibility. Before Milne Bay, the Japanese military, particularly the SNLF, was widely regarded across the Pacific as an unstoppable force in jungle warfare. Their psychological tactics, fanatical courage, and mastery of infiltration had brought them swift, total victory in Singapore, Malaya, and the Philippines. Milne Bay shattered that belief. It was the first decisive land defeat suffered by the Imperial Japanese Army in WWII. The strategic consequences were immediate and profound. The Japanese objective at Milne Bay was to establish a major forward airbase to threaten northern Australia and provide air cover for their simultaneous campaign along the Kokoda track. The successful defence of the Allied airfields by the Australians denied the Japanese this critical support. The RAAF Kittyhawks continued to operate, protecting the crucial Port Moresby supply line and providing air superiority over the Kokoda campaign, a factor that proved instrumental in ultimately pushing the Japanese back across Papua. Had Milne Bay fallen, the entire defensive picture of the Southwest Pacific would have collapsed. The victory provided the Allies with a massive morale boost. For the Australians, who had suffered continuous defeats and threats of invasion, the success at Milne Bay proved that the Japanese could be stopped, contained, and defeated in the unforgiving environment of the jungle. It instilled a crucial, powerful sense of confidence that would fuel their devastating counteroffensives in the years to come. The battle also showcased the superior logistics and integrated warfare capabilities of the Allies. The Australian General Staff successfully anticipated the attack, reinforced the militia with hardened AIF veterans, and ensured the airfields, the primary objective, were fully operational. The seamless cooperation between the ground troops, AIF and militia, and the RAAF Kittyhawks established a precedent for close air support that the Japanese simply could not match. The Japanese, hampered by poor intelligence and an over-reliance on a single, inflexible tactical doctrine, the Banzai Charge, found their psychological weapons utterly useless against a disciplined, entrenched defense, backed by overwhelming firepower from the air. The legacy of Milne Bay is a testament to preparation, discipline, and the power of combined arms. It was a victory won not by raw numbers, but by meticulous planning, the effective use of terrain, and the sheer tenacity of the Australian soldier. The militia, initially underestimated, proved their worth, holding the line until the seasoned AIF forces could deliver the decisive blow. The Battle of Milne Bay was a small, brutal affair when compared to the vast scale of the war, but its outcome sent a shockwave through both the Allied and Axis high commands. For the Allies, it was proof that the tide could be turned. For the Japanese, it was the first as chilling confirmation that the path to victory was now blocked by an increasingly formidable and professional enemy. The era of easy Japanese conquest was definitively over. The story of Milne Bay is often overshadowed by the major battles of Guadalcanal and Midway, but its strategic importance is undeniable. If you believe these forgotten victories and the fierce courage of the Australian forces deserve more recognition, please hit that subscribe button right now. Your support helps us uncover more pivotal, untold moments in military history. The lessons learned at Milne Bay were immediately applied across the Pacific. The tactical superiority demonstrated by the Australians, using firepower to counter the bayonet charge and establishing air supremacy, became the template for future jungle operations. The battle stands as a monument to the fierce determination of the Australian soldier and the strategic genius of anticipating and preparing for an attack based on the enemy's strengths. The jungle ambush that shocked the Japanese commanders was, in fact, a calculated trap, successfully sprung at the perfect time. The courage of the men at Milne Bay ensured that the war against Japan would be long and brutal, but the strategic initiative had irrevocably passed to the Allies. What moment in the Battle of Milne Bay the Kittyhawks' first strafing run, or the failure of the final Banzai charge, do you believe was the true turning point that shattered the Japanese myth? Share your historical analysis in the comments below.